Good evening. This is Amicus Briefs for Public Poetry. I'm Dom Zacconi. With us this evening, we have Robin Davidson. Robin is a poet, translator. She's a professor of English. She has two chapbooks, Kneeling in the Dojo and The City That Ripens on the Tree of the World. She was the second Houston Poet Laureate, uh, appointed by Mayor Annise Parker, our Mayor Laureate of books. Currently, she has Dear Miss Schubert translation, which are wonderful poems. New Miss Schmetterling. She did Houston Favorite Poems, which was a wonderful collection. Luminous Other. She's here with us today. Robin, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Dom, thanks so much for having me. What a pleasure.
Oh,
Really.
you've made the city what it is.
Yeah,
Thank you for this.
I'm
Uh,
glad to be here.
what are you working on now?
Well, I've just finished a manuscript of poems that, at least at the moment, is called The City Within.
Mhm.
And it's the most autobiographical collection of poems I've ever worked on. And since I'm 70, and this starts with my childhood and being born in Trieste, which is now Italy, but was not Trieste, was not in Italy at the time of my birth, and moving forward to my current moment here in Houston. It's actually a very personal collection of poems. I've just finished it. I've sent it out a few places. I just hope someone, will want it. I don't know. And I'm also doing this really amazing. I've had the great joy of working with a woman named Dr. Catherine Carls, who is a translator of French and of Polish poetry. And she asked me to translate some poems from the Polish of a Ravensbrück survivor. And so I'm beginning to work on those. I'm almost done with, well, I'm more than beginning. I've been working on it a while. But I have just maybe 5 more poems to go out of about 42. And then we'll see what happens with those. But they're, oh, wow, they're really moving just about what it was to be in this women's camp during the Holocaust. It was really horrific. So, and she was a girl, the young woman that wrote these poems. She was just a girl. So, yeah. So that's
That's
what I'm
really
doing.
difficult work for you, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I don't know an easy way to move to the questions, but I'll just say, okay, we're going to the questions.
I like it.
Okay, what's your favorite place to read a poem?
Well, I am going to interpret that question as my favorite place to read poems to myself rather than performing them. And mostly, I guess I'd say I can read poems anywhere and any place, and I'm always happy to do that, except in bed right before I go to sleep, because they wake me up. I mean, if I read a book of poems or begin reading a book of poems before I try to go to sleep, I can't go to sleep for about 3 hours. So I don't do that. But I would say, of all the places that I read poems, this little study that I'm sitting in right here in my tiny study, surrounded by my books, in an 4-year-old house, is probably my favorite place to be. And I have a little reading chair that I love. And I just love being in this room. It's quiet and I have all my books.
Cool.
Yeah.
What was the first poem you remember getting? Like getting it.
Yeah. Wow. Well, as I said, I'm 70. I've been reading poems since I was about 7 or 8 years old. So this question was really hard for me, honestly. It's one I thought more about than all but one other of the questions. And so I'm going to read to you what I wrote, because I
Sure.
didn't think I could just talk about it extemporaneously. So I can tell you that one poet whose work I came to love and actually understand, I think, after a semester-long course on the American Sublime with beloved Edward Hirsch. He's just a superb teacher. In which we students read the collected poems, several volumes of prose, and a biography of Wallace Stevens. I loved Stevens' poems as a college student when I was about 19. And I loved a book called The Poem at the End of the Mind. And I will tell you, I did not understand any of that book, but that didn't matter to me. I loved the sound of the words. I loved the lines as they seemed to float around in my head. And I carried some of those lines with me for many, many years. Stevens is not an accessible poet. And, anybody that's tried to read him can tell you that. And there are few people in his poems. And honestly, they may be really very lonely poems. But I think he is a marvel as a poet of ideas, because he's able to incarnate those ideas in a way that's thrilling to me, as if the ideas themselves were the characters of people thinking and acting in the poems. And he's also developed this vocabulary of symbols, which is really fascinating. And once you kind of discover that code, then, it allows the poems to really unravel as like this giant puzzle that you can unravel, or a labyrinth even. You can unpack what I would say is a mysterious message about the past or the future, about existential issues or whatever. And here's the last thing I want to say about him. In many ways, I find the genius of Kevin Proofer's poems, I love Kevin's poems, equivalent to Stevens, though not necessarily in theme or in imagery, but in intelligence and in cadenced revelations and in the greatness of his quest. So Stevens and Proofer are two of my favorite poets writing in English. Yeah.
Well, if you could ask a question of any past writer or artist, who would that be? What would you ask them?
Well, that was an easy one for me. I think the person that I would ask is Yvonne Boland. And so many people listening are going to know her as an Irish poet and a brilliant poet. And I would consider her, for me, I read all of her books, both prose and poetry, over the years. And I find her work fascinating. They really explore the domestic sphere and women's experience of the domestic sphere. They explore women's experience of the public sphere, which in Ireland, and not so different in the US, is really that of a patriarchal culture. And they really look at history. So all of that stuff, thrilled me. And so one of her books, and she came to Rice University, to the Fondren Library there, I don't know when, maybe 1998 or something. And she read from her book, The Lost Land. And I love that book. It's a book about mothers and daughters. It uses a lot of myth, it's mythical, but it's also autobiographical. I love that book. And later I was reading in an interview that she thought it was the least successful of all of her books, that it was a failed book of poems. I thought, what in the world? So this is my question. I would ask her, were she still living and were I able to find her, why did she feel this book was a failed book? I mean, it's stunning. And I want to just read like a couple of lines from this one poem that I thought a lot about as I was trying to figure out what to say about her. The poem is called The Necessity for Irony. And what it talks about is her going into junk stores, antique shops and fairs, junk sales, and looking for cool, beautiful things. And then at the very end, she goes in, by the way, with her 12-year-old daughter. It's a long poem. At the very end, she says, "Spirit of irony, my caustic author of the past, of memory, reproach me now. Remind me that I was in those rooms with my child, with my back turned to her, searching, oh, irony, for beautiful things." And as a mother, that just knocked me out. because our children are one of the great beauties of our lives, you know. So yeah, I just love her. Boland is a genius.
Well, let's go to the next one. What do you think contemporary writing gets right?
Okay,
What
this
do you
was the
think it
other
misses?
hard question for me, Dom. Oh,
That's
what
where
is
you get, that's why I'm paying so much.
that's what does it get right? What does it miss? Okay, I'm reading this to you because I
Sure.
know I could never reconfigure this extemporaneously. Here's my thinking on it. Writing in any era, is an artifact of its time. The cultural values, historical conflicts, issues of social class, race, gender, you know, all that stuff. So I wouldn't say that the writing of our moment gets anything right or wrong. It arises out of the experience of those poets writing now, and that writing varies from culture to culture, whether it's American poetry or the poems of Israeli or Palestinian poets, or of East European poets, you know, like my teacher, Adam Zagajewski, or Ewa Lipska, the woman whose work I translate. I want to go back for a moment to Stevens and refer to one of his poems. And it's a poem I love. It's called A Postcard from the Volcano. You probably know it. But those first 3 lines, that first stanza, children picking up our bones will never know that these were once as quick as foxes on the hill. I love those lines. The poem suggests that the writing we leave behind is a kind of written fragment of human experience at a particular moment in a particular place in the lives of a particular person or people. Our writing is our legacy to the future. And I want to give some examples out of, you know, different kinds of writing. So, for example, think about Wordsworth and Coleridge. I'm probably taking too long to say all this, but I love poetry. I love talking about it. British literature, Wordsworth and Coleridge. Those guys were very interested in bringing the ordinary into neoclassic, you know, kind of refuting neoclassical verse, right? And the elitism of that. And one of the reasons for that is because of the Industrial Revolution and all of the change in social class and the rising up of lower social classes in England. Who else? Thinking of Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. Think about those really expansive verses of Whitman, or those anti-puritanical verses, those little tight verses of Emily Dickinson, and they're really anti-Puritan. You know, she got kicked out of Mount Holyoke. We see in that, you know, this expanding America, the expanding American landscape, and you know, moving toward democracy. So that's kind of, I see that verse as really exploring democracy, both those poets. I also am thinking about my dear friend Carolyn Forche and her wonderful book. I think it was published in '94, called The Angel of History. And what she does in that book is she uses the notebook form. And she uses that notebook form, I would say, as a form of witnessing human atrocity, human suffering. For example, you know, one of the long poems has to do with the bombing of Hiroshima. So that's something Carolyn does, you know, right in that moment of the 20th century. And then there is Tyehimba Jess. I mean, I just think that guy's a genius. He's a Black poet. He loves music. He wrote a wonderful book about a Black blues musician, Leadbelly. But his more current book that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2017 is called Olio. And that book uses documentary poetics. And he uses that to really talk about the conflicts of race in our contemporary culture and its roots in slavery. And, you know, he has a couple of crowns of sonnets in there, which are very traditional. Then he has all this documentary material. So I don't think you can get it wrong if you're recording your moment. And how else can we write but out of where we live and the time we live in, you know, and who we are. So that's
After that, I'm kind of frightened to ask the next question. If 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 you had to get rid of all the books in your library except what you could put into a cardboard box,
Yeah.
what would be in your cardboard box?
Well, first of all, I would never do that. I would off myself before I got rid of these books.
And just before you begin, you have to be able to lift the cardboard box.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, so before this happens, I will go back to weightlifting. No, but Dom, I took this question seriously, honestly, and I listed out about 18 or 20 books that I do think, given their weight, because poetry books are very slim for
Sure.
the most part.
20's fine.
Yeah, okay. So there's 20 here. Now I can read them out to you. I'll try to remember them, but a lot of those I have right in front of me behind this laptop screen that I keep in front of me all the time, that I read from all the time. Let me tell you what those books are, and then there's just a few more besides that. So the books that are right in front of me at the moment, Adam Zagajewski's Mysticism for Beginners and his book Trimmer, that I don't have a copy of, that hasn't been ruined by water. My husband gave me a galley of that he found on eBay or something years and years ago. I have Carolyn Forche's The Angel of History and her most recent volume, In the Lateness of the World. I also have Ed Hirsch's book, Earthly Measures. It is my favorite book of all Ed's books, and his book on how to read a poem and fall in love with poetry. I teach that book all the time. I also have my friend Ewa Lipska's book, Droga Pani Schubert, in Polish, which means Dear Miss Schubert, and I've translated those poems. And also her newest volume, which I have not translated, but I've read, and they're just brilliant. And they're called Variacje Goldbergowskie, which means the Goldberg variations, and they are so smart. They're so smart. Anyway, we'll talk about that later. And then two novelists work I have. Paul Auster, I don't know if you know him, is a New York novelist. He's brilliant. He's probably he and his wife are my favorite novelists of all time. Paul Auster's book, the Book of Illusions, and also a memoir called The Invention of Solitude. And then also his wife's book, Siri Hustvedt's book, The Blazing World. I mean, these three books have changed my life in terms of fiction memoir. They're just stunning. And then I love Joy Harjo's American Sunrise. I would take that book with me. Also, Langston Hughes's The Weary Blues. I teach it all the time, and I've loved that book for many, many, many years. And a little bit newer book, I think it's out from Copper Canyon, called How to Carry Water by Lucille Clifton. It's a big, thick book, so it's heavy, but it still probably would fit. And then a couple more. Rilke's The Book of Images, translated by Ed Snow. That is a beautiful book. And Ed Snow is a beautiful translator of the German. Also, I'd take Wallace Stevens' collected poems. I might take Emily Dickinson's collected. If not, I'd have to take something smaller. And the last two books I would take are Kevin Proofer's book, How He Loved Them, and the newest one. And if you guys out there listening don't have The Fears, you should buy The Fears. I think it's his best book so far. That's about 20 books. And I think I could live with that. Not sure. That's it.
There you go.
The Fears. Also, I want to show you this book. This is brand new, came today. This is Paul Auster's new book called Baumgartner. I haven't read it, but I know it will be beautiful because Paul's a beautiful writer.
This is excellent. Well, let's step to the more esoteric. What makes something art?
Oh dear. Okay. Well, this was very difficult for me. I began to think about what my grandmother used to always say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The next line that came to me was Keats's line, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. But Keats was a really young man in his 20s when he died. And, I'll just say that not all truth is beautiful, right? So I think I would have to define, I would say art is about creating, okay, that there is the capacity for art in any human activity that's created. It's not destruction. So it's not acts of violence or acts of atrocity. So maybe to define, for me anyway, what art is not. So this is what I wrote down. It's not the destruction that Putin's regime continues to wreak on Ukraine. It's not the killing of innocent Israelis at a music festival or in a kibbutz perpetrated by Hamas. It's not the killing of innocent Palestinians or the denial of food, water, medical care to those living in Gaza by Netanyahu's government. It's not the action of any racist in the U.S. who's perpetrated some violence against a person of color. I believe that art in its many forms lifts us up, right? It lifts us up. We may not be able to transcend the grief of our particular circumstances, but art can bring moments of joy. It can bring healing and hope, or at least consolation and the possibility of mutual understanding. And to be honest, for me, poetry is art because, for many reasons, but one of the central reasons is that it offers us the possibility, it offers the possibility of teaching us how to love. And I feel very strongly that that's what art can do. So,
That's wonderful. Thank you for
yeah,
that.
I love poetry.
Okay. What poem would you read to your father? And will you read it for us now?
Yes, I would love to. My dad was a very kind man and very generous and a great father. He was also, I think, a man plagued by great anxiety. Zoe, this is my dog, one of my dogs, by great anxiety and by doubt, and was very distressed, by his own faithlessness in a deity. So I guess as a kid, I wanted more than, and he would read to me, for example, from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He was in the service. He was in World War II. He was a night fighter pilot in World War II. He saw he saw a great deal of suffering and he lost friends and all of that. So he knew war. And so as a child, I think I always wanted somehow to comfort him or to offer him some kind of consolation. And even though really he was the one that always created a safe space for me. So I think now, given he died in 2005, before he ever saw me publish a book of poems, certainly before he ever saw me, become a poet laureate in my own home city. I've been here for over 50 years. And so I really think the poems I would draw on for him, because he was, by the time he was an old man, he died at 81, he was he felt a deep sense of faith in the deity, in a deity, and in the possibility of an afterlife. And so I've chosen a poem I love Gerard Manley Hopkins myself, and I've chosen a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins that I think he would love. Not one of those dark sonnets. I wake to feel the fell of dark, not day. I mean, that was my dad all over the place. Just really a struggling man in a lot of ways. But I think that he would love this poem, as I do, for its language, its amazing language, the sprung rhythm, all of that stuff. But I think he would also love it, for its confidence, for its faith, its lack of doubt, honestly, and for its promise, of consolation and protection. So that's why I would choose this poem for my dad.
Okay.
And it's called God's Grandeur. It's a beautiful poem. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, have trod, have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell, not smile, shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, O morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings.
Oh, thank you for that.
Yeah,
That was,
I love this poem, and I love that last image, this great mother hen, that is just hovering above us, taking care of us. And especially right now, that's a very powerful.
it's something I feel comfortable. I would give me great comfort too.
Good. Good.
Robin, thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you for sharing so much. You were wonderful to talk with.
Thank you.
Thanks for all you do in the community. Thanks for all you do for poetry, all the work that you do at night that no one knows about. Thank you for your time.
It's my great pleasure to be here. And poetry gives a lot back to me. So I'm grateful for that. And Dom, thank you for doing this for all of us poets.
Well, I'm happy to do it. It's really pleasant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.